She wired herself our life savings while I was clearing debris from a market bombing, I said aloud, though no one else was in the tent. The heat pressed in. My phone screen had gone dark 3 minutes ago after I read the part about the divorce. No explanation, just a PDF and a balance of 0. I had sand in my teeth, a radio on my hip, and 24 more hours on patrol. My CO was still shouting outside, but all I could think about was how she waited until I was thousands of miles away to vanish with everything. Everything except the part of me she could not reach. The base compound sat in a hollowed-out stretch of dust and concrete, its buildings stacked like shipping containers, heat-warped and featureless. Inside, the operations tent hummed with tired, recycled air. The fluorescent tubes above our heads flickered in and out, casting pale flashes across the weather-stained maps and broken printer trays. I had been stationed here for 9 months, my second deployment in 5 years, and everything about this place felt halfway broken, like the people who kept it running. My role was coordination lead for logistics and asset movement, secure convoys, medical extractions, satellite comms. Quiet, procedural, and thankless. I handled the reports no one wanted to write, the supply chains no one checked, and the emergencies that made someone else's name look heroic. I was not out there stacking medals, but without my documentation and routing, those who were would be flying blind. I never saw my name on the announcements. My rank moved slower than others who arrived after me. Not yet, they said when I asked about advancement, always with a friendly hand on the shoulder, always with a look that told me I should feel lucky to be trusted with so much. I never pushed. I had a wife back home, a mortgage, and a sense of duty drilled deeper than doubt. I made it work. I ignored how long the coffee machine had been broken, how the router constantly dropped signal during uploads. I stopped expecting repair orders to be fulfilled and learned how to jerry-rig the satellite cradle myself. Captain Mercer, our liaison with HQ, never raised his voice, never needed to. He was polished, always immaculate in a way that made everyone else seem out of uniform. He took long calls in private, I scanning the room like a man inspecting damage he already expected. When he complimented you, it came like a correction, a reminder that you had almost let yourself believe you were worth more than the assignment. Efficient as ever, he said to me once, handing back a logistics brief I had revised 3 times under his shifting requirements. No wonder they keep you here. There was nothing overt, nothing you could file a report on. He simply knew how to make usefulness feel like a warning. Letters from home had started thinning out months ago. I told myself it was the time zones, the chaos. She had never liked when I left, and I took her silence as her own kind of protest. I wrote anyway, describing the landscape, the way the sky looked before sunrise, the stray dog that slept near the comms trailer and refused to leave. She never mentioned reading them. On video calls, she smiled tightly, background always blurred. I noticed her hands were rarely in frame. I did not ask why. I wanted to trust her. I needed something back home to remain untouched. The silence became part of the routine, like the grinding of the old HVAC unit or the half-second lag in radio transmissions. I told myself I was building something. Sacrifice now, stability later. I held my tongue when newer officers were promoted around me. I filled in when we were understaffed, volunteered to cover shifts so others could sleep. I worked as if someone was watching who might reward consistency. But nothing came, only more work, more empty acknowledgments. Mercer once said I was the backbone of quiet success. It sounded like a eulogy. I laughed because I was supposed to. Then I went back to triple-checking our outgoing supply chain routes, alone in a room where the overhead light blinked just slow enough to be maddening. The night after the wire transfer cleared and the divorce papers landed in my inbox, I stayed behind in the comms trailer long after the last log sheet was filed. The air conditioning was out again, and the server fans throbbed in the background like a distant heartbeat, louder now because I could hear myself think. For once, I let the terminal idle and opened a tab that had nothing to do with convoy routing or fuel estimates. The military career portal loaded slowly, then jammed. I tried a civilian job board next, logistics coordinator, defense contractor, remote eligible. I clicked without thinking, just to see. It felt like dragging a hand across a surface to remember what smoothness was.
My resume had not been touched in 4 years. The document opened with a timestamp from my last promotion attempt, a title that had since been handed to someone else after I trained them. I scrolled down the bullet points. Words like adaptive, proactive, mission critical. I had meant them once. Now they looked like decorations on a grave. I updated 1 or 2 dates, adjusted a phrasing. I stared at the empty summary section for 10 full minutes before typing nothing and closing the document. Not yet. Outside, the compound lights flickered with their usual inconsistency, but something about it suddenly looked more intentional, like a place designed to wear you down without ever breaking you fully. My chair listed slightly to the left, a broken wheel wedged under it with cardboard. The ceiling panel above me had water damage from last month's leak, still unpatched. I could see the layers now, not just of physical neglect, but of what it meant, how much we accepted as normal, and how much I had agreed to disappear into it, hoping someone else would eventually notice. I kept the job tab open. I clicked the bookmark icon. That was all. But something changed in the gesture, quiet and unspoken, the way someone might reach for the door handle in a dream, not to leave yet, but to know that it was still unlocked. 3 days later, just past 0300, I received a message through my private inbox, one I rarely used except for personal notes or documents I did not want routed through the base system. The sender's name stopped me. Alina Morse, former operations director at Centralog Global, now consulting across several defense-adjacent firms. I had met her once during a NATO coordination summit in Brussels 2 years prior. She had spoken with clarity and without performance in a room full of men who talked in bar graphs and obfuscation. I remembered how she had asked specific questions about one of my rerouting models after the panel. She had remembered my name. Her message was brief but precise. Saw a logistics briefing stamped with your name. Still the cleanest escalation matrix I have seen. Curious, are you still active duty or open to discussing a stateside role? Quiet, but important. Let me know. That was it. No attachments, no pitch. The respect was built into the brevity. She assumed I had value. She offered no favor. I did not respond immediately. Instead, I read the message 3 times, then went outside and stood beside the perimeter fence where the dust collects in permanent drifts. The wind carried bits of radio chatter and the hollow thump of distant movement drills. I looked back at the buildings, corrugated walls, antennas lashed with duct tape, light bleeding unevenly from a window someone had patched with a clipboard. Mercer had barricaded a junior officer earlier that day for failing to include him in a minor transmission loop. The lecture lasted 40 minutes. The comms officer stood without speaking while Mercer gestured to the word chain on a whiteboard, underlined 4 times. We were all meant to see it and internalize its meaning. The contrast made my stomach knot. Elena's words implied trust, autonomy, purpose. Not noise, not gatekeeping. Even in her 3-line email, there was space to move, to decide. I found myself pacing, slowly at first, then faster, as if trying to catch up with the implications. I wrote back the next morning, brief and professional. Still active duty for the next few months, but open to conversation. Appreciate your outreach. I hovered over the send button for a full minute. I was not disloyal. I had spent years proving that, but something inside me had shifted. I was no longer sure what my loyalty had earned, aside from silence, erosion, and the casual cruelty of being invisible until someone needed a fallback. When I finally hit send, it did not feel like rebellion. It felt like breathing without asking permission. But I did not print my resume. I did not tell anyone. I returned to work as if nothing had changed because outwardly, nothing had. The shift remained private, coiled, and deliberate, but a door had opened, and this time, I had noticed. I submitted the resignation quietly 3 weeks after that meeting. No announcement, no dramatics, just a typed memo, formally worded, citing my transition to civilian operations and upcoming opportunity in stateside logistics. I included the requisite notice window, offered to assist in a phased handoff, and closed with a sentence of gratitude that I had revised 7 times to sound respectful but unsentimental. I delivered it in person, sealed in an envelope to Captain Mercer's office at the end of shift when the lights were dim, the hallway mostly silent, and the building carried the strange stillness of something about to fracture.
He read it once, then again, slower, as if parsing for a clause he could weaponize. "You have been speaking with someone at Centralog," he said flatly, not asking. "Morse, I assume she is the reason behind this sudden shift in loyalty? He tapped the paper once, index finger steady. You realize, of course, that sharing classified procedural knowledge with a civilian contractor, even inadvertently, is grounds for full review under Article 92. The accusation was as polished as his boots, slipped in like a handshake. I did not flinch. I reminded him, politely, evenly, that my record remained clean, that I had signed no non-disclosure exclusive to internal routing methods, and any transfer of knowledge would follow lawful declassification and redaction standards. I spoke like I had rehearsed it, because I had. Still, his posture changed. The calmness turned surgical. "This is disappointing," he said finally, pushing the envelope away as if it carried disease. "Not because we cannot replace you, we can, but because you mistook quiet value for leverage. That misunderstanding tends to follow people. I hope your new contacts are prepared to contextualize your history accurately." There it was. Not a threat, not directly, but a promise. Of the kind of reputational decay that begins in shadows. A call, a question, a hesitation in someone else's HR meeting, a narrative of unreliability crafted in absences and implications. I nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement of what had just been done. He would not come after me with formal charges. He would simply infect the air around me, quietly, permanently. But Elena called me the next morning. Not a message, a direct call. Her voice steady, clipped, focused. "Just got a background verification ping from your base. Oblique language, subtle red flags." I overruled it. She did not explain how. She did not need to. "I trust you," she said. "Their discomfort is a signal you were more essential than they admitted. Let it validate you, not haunt you." I stared at the map board across from my bunk, still dotted with red wax pencil from last month's recon detail. I had traced those routes in blackout conditions. I had rerouted wounded transport under live fire. I had held this place together in ways they could not log or replicate. And now they were trying to scrub the evidence I ever mattered. But I felt no urge to argue. When I walked the compound that afternoon, I saw it differently. The same flickering lights, the same sagging antenna cables, the same half-working gear, but the spell was broken. Not because I had escaped, but because I no longer sought their approval. Every cracked panel, every taped-up terminal now looked exactly like what it had always been, a system built on borrowed labor and emotional extortion, disguised as duty. I did not celebrate. I filed my logs, completed the handoff brief, and returned every item on my checkout list down to the last ID badge. When I boarded the outbound flight 2 weeks later, I did not look back, not because I was bitter, but because I no longer needed to prove that I had been there at all. The first sign came in the form of a forwarded client memo, unintended, sent to an outdated liaison address, then passed to me by Elena with nothing more than a short note. "This is the fallout you predicted." The client in question was a multinational transport contractor we had supported through 2 volatile corridors. I had overseen their logistics chain for 16 consecutive months, adapting routes mid-crisis, absorbing last-minute changes that saved them millions. They were known for loyalty, but only when competence remained stable. The memo was blunt. Operational inconsistencies following recent personnel turnover have created unacceptable exposure. Effective immediately, we are suspending coordination with Central Command Logistics until continuity is restored or transitioned. There was no anger in their language, just precision, the kind that follows when faith is quietly revoked. Mercer's replacement had not lasted 6 weeks. He had come from a more decorated background, but lacked familiarity with the timing intricacies and terrain conditions that only field-logged experience could teach. He delegated too broadly, ignored warning flags in the comms reports, and failed to renegotiate the secondary routing when customs protocol shifted. The client noticed. They always did. 2 days after the suspension, Elena pulled me into a strategy call. It was short, clinical. "They want to re-engage?" Directly with us, we made no overtures, but they asked for you by name, said they trusted your operational logic. I told them we did too. She left a pause long enough to register, but not long enough for false modesty.
You can lead it if you want. Build your own team. Clean slate. I accepted, not for the symbolism, but for the clarity. The work itself was the reward: precision, autonomy, and the ability to solve problems without internal sabotage. I made no reference to Mercer, no mention of what had failed. I began sketching workflow hierarchies, identifying the analysts I would need, drawing from both military and civilian pools. There was no ceremony, just clean paper, a clear mandate, and none of the muted disdain I had carried for so long. Meanwhile, reports from the old compound reached me in fragments. 2 more staffers resigned. A satellite relay misfire delayed an evacuation drill. Procurement requests went unanswered. Mercer had assumed command of the gap himself and was now under internal review after 2 contract violations surfaced. Nothing criminal, nothing dramatic, just paperwork failures that would be enough to keep him from rising further. No scandal, just quiet erosion. The same kind he had once orchestrated against others, now turned inward, his systems breaking the way they always broke, slowly, imperceptibly, until the damage could no longer be denied. But I did not dwell. I was now leading a streamlined division with full autonomy. Our systems were clean, our escalation models agile, our client relations transparent. I built redundancy into our workflows so that one person would become indispensable, and no one would be punished for becoming too competent. I held weekly check-ins that emphasized foresight over blame. I enforced boundaries, not silence. I made it clear we earned trust by making ourselves obsolete one day at a time, through clarity, not mystique. I never once used Mercer's name in reference. I did not need to. The contrast said enough. Where his world depended on withholding and performance, mine ran on visibility and execution. And while his empire frayed under the weight of its own manipulations, I let my work speak, not for vindication, not for applause, but because I finally remembered what it felt like to operate in the system that did not feed on exhaustion. The consequences had nothing to do with revenge. They were the natural results of choices, his, mine, and everyone who had once believed that loyalty meant silence. It arrived on a Tuesday morning like any other. An internal industry bulletin forwarded by a former colleague who had quietly transitioned out of the unit 6 months earlier. The headline was understated, nearly clinical. Leadership restructuring underway following operational audit at regional command. There was no mention of Mercer in the title, but the body of the report named him directly. Captain Thomas Mercer, formerly overseeing logistics coordination in redacted region, has been reassigned pending review of procedural irregularities and contract non-compliance. Interim leadership will assume operational duties effective immediately. No charges, no headlines on cable news, just enough to register across defense forums and inboxes. It took less than 24 hours for the ripples to spread. A memo from one of our newer clients referenced the news with surgical subtlety. We appreciate CentralLog's proactive engagement model, especially in light of recent leadership volatility elsewhere in the sector. Another team lead forwarded a LinkedIn update from a former subordinate of Mercer's, now announcing his transition into the private sector. The exodus had begun. Not loud, not defiant, just a series of quiet exits, like people slowly realizing the emergency lights had been on for years and only now deciding to walk toward the door. Within our division, no one celebrated. There was no victory lap, no mention of what had triggered the unraveling. I continued to run morning operation reviews, flagged incoming supply alerts, and worked through deployment modeling with the newer analysts. I answered questions, issued correction protocols when needed, and made space for feedback from junior staff without filtering it through rank or performance theater. I did not reference Mercer. There was no need. His removal was not my doing. It was the inevitable result of the system he designed, a structure so brittle that the moment it lost the invisible labor propping it up, it collapsed under its own unacknowledged negligence.
What had taken years to uphold had fallen in weeks, not because anyone pushed, but because no one stayed. Clients had moved on, teams had recalibrated. There was no void left to fill, only space that now felt breathable. The final irony was this: the very qualities Mercer punished, transparency, foresight, interdependence, had become the metrics clients now cited as essential. Structural change did not come as a speech or a headline. It came as a shift in expectation. Firms rewrote their escalation protocols. Internal audits were moved up. The assumption that loyalty required silence began to erode. And the standard Mercer once enforced, that authority was earned by gatekeeping, was replaced by something quieter, but far more resilient: competence without threat. I read the bulletin again that night, before archiving it. I did not forward it. I did not speak of it in meetings. I closed the tab and went back to work, knowing the system had adjusted, not because I forced it to, but because it could no longer ignore its own weight. And for the first time in years, I felt no obligation to explain how it happened. The call came on a quiet Sunday evening, just after I finished reviewing a routing contingency draft from one of our newer analysts. My mother's voice crackled lightly on the line, clearer than usual, but still carrying that gentle pause she always gave before asking anything too direct. "You sound different," she said after a while. "Less tight." I smiled into the silence, unsure how to explain a change that had not come from one moment, but from a long series of ones I had once ignored. I stopped trying to prove I belonged, started building something where people do not have to earn respect by being invisible. She exhaled, half relief, half memory. She had watched me serve year after year, without questioning my loyalty, but quietly mourning what it cost. I told her about the team I was building, how I refused to let performance reviews become tactical weapons, how no one would be punished for asking questions out loud. I had begun mentoring a junior logistics officer who reminded me of myself 5 years ago. Sharp, over-prepared, afraid to take credit. I made sure he knew that execution mattered more than performance theater. I showed him how to document everything, not for approval, but for truth. I still worked long hours. The problems were no smaller. But the air felt different, clearer, less conditional. The authority I carried now did not rest on silence or posturing. It rested on clarity, on showing people what fairness looks like when no one is forced to ask for it. Before we ended the call, my mother asked if I had any regrets about leaving when I did. I paused, then answered plainly, only that I stayed silent for so long, thinking dignity had to be earned. She said nothing, but I could hear her smile. Because in the end, it was never just about leaving. It was about learning, finally, that loyalty works both ways.